Viewers. It is educational and avoids glorifying violence or extremist actions. Muammar Gaddafi, Rise and Fall of a Leader, opening archival footage of Libya's deserts and Tripoli skyline. For over 4 decades, one man stood at the center of Libyan politics, a figure praised by some, criticized by many, and remembered by all. His name, Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi was born in 1942 near Sirte, in a Bedouin tent. He came from a poor family and grew up herding animals under the North African sun. As a young man, he entered military school, where his political ideas began to grow. Inspired by Arab nationalism and leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser, he dreamed of reshaping Libya. The Coup. Dramatic music. Footage of 1960s Libya. In 1969, at the age of just 27, Gaddafi led a bloodless coup that overthrew King Idris. He declared the birth of a new Libya Oni, free from monarchy, one he believed would belong to the people. The era of corruption is over. Power belongs to the masses. The rule of Gaddafi. Images of Gaddafi in military uniform, giving speeches. Gaddafi ruled Libya for more than 40 years. He introduced his own political philosophy, outlined in his Green Book, promoting a form of socialism mixed with tribal traditions. Libya under Gaddafi experienced major changes. Oil revenues were nationalized, free education and healthcare expanded, infrastructure projects transformed cities, but his rule was also authoritarian. Political opposition was suppressed, and critics often disappeared or fled the country. Global controversies. News clips of international tensions and sanctions. Internationally, Gaddafi's government was accused of supporting militant groups and being linked to attacks abroad. In the 1980s and 1990s, Libya faced sanctions, isolation, and global pressure. For years, Gaddafi remained a controversial figure seen by some as a revolutionary, by others as a dictator. The Arab Spring. Footage of 2011 protests in North Africa. In 2011, a wave of protests swept across the Arab world. Libya was no exception. Demonstrations calling for change turned into an armed conflict. Foreign military intervention followed, and Gaddafi's government collapsed. Footage of conflict zones. On October 20, 2011, Muammar Gaddafi was captured and killed during fighting in Sirte. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter for Libya. Legacy. Images fade between Libya before and after 2011. Muammar Gaddafi remains one of the most debated figures of modern history. To some, he was a revolutionary who used oil wealth to build a nation. To others, he was a ruler who silenced dissent and held power too tightly for too long. His story is one of power, ambition, controversy, and a reminder of how leadership can shape a nation. Libyan oil-rich nation in North Africa with a story marked by revolution, power, prosperity, and later instability. To understand Libya today, we must look at 2 periods: Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, and Libya after his rule. Libya. Before Gaddafi, pre-1969. Before Gaddafi rose to power in 1969, Libya was ruled by King Idris. Oil had just been discovered, but much of the wealth flowed outward, not to the people. Infrastructure was limited. Education and healthcare were still developing, and many citizens lived in poverty. In 1969, a young army captain, Muammar Gaddafi, led a coup and took control. His rule lasted 42 years. Under Gaddafi, Libya changed dramatically. Positive developments often noted. Education and healthcare became free. Libya reached one of the highest literacy rates in Africa. Oil profits were used to build roads, housing, and water systems. The Great Man-Made River Project provided water to cities and farms. But his rule was also criticized. Political opposition was banned. Media was controlled by the state. Many reports accused his government of human rights violations. Power rested heavily in his hands. For some, Gaddafi represented African independence and pride. For others, he was a dictator who limited freedoms. His rule remained controversial both inside Libya and across the world. In 2011, protests and conflicts spread during the Arab Spring. NATO forces intervened. Gaddafi was removed and killed. What followed changed Libya deeply. Many hoped for democracy, but instead Libya experienced civil war between rival groups, divided governments and political instability, decline in national security, damage to infrastructure and economy. Oil production became inconsistent. Yet even after years of struggle, Libyans continue to work toward peace-seeking stability, unity, and a better future. The story of Libya is complex. Under Gaddafi, the nation saw development, central authority, and social programs, but also restrictions on political freedoms. After Gaddafi, Libya gained the possibility of democracy, yet faced conflict, division, and hardship. Neither era is simple. Both shaped the identity of Libya, and the future, it still waits to be written by the people. At the time of his death in 2011, some senior Libyan officials claimed Gaddafi had secretly salted away more than $200 billion in bank accounts, real estate, gold, and corporate investments around the world. The Washington Post. According to that estimate, the assets would amount to roughly $30,000 for every Libyan citizen at the time, which gave the figure even more political and social resonance. The Washington Post. Some sources use a similar top-end estimate to claim Gaddafi was one of the richest people in the world before his fall. Investigations after his death froze many assets worldwide, banks, real estate, investments, but tracking all of them has been extremely difficult. And Minbar Libya, or some analysts argue that a portion of the wealth attributed to him may actually have belonged to state institutions, oil revenues, sovereign funds, etc. Not to him personally, making it hard to distinguish personal assets from state assets. The Mail Guardian. Different sources give much lower estimates. For instance, after seizing and freezing some assets, some reports suggest that at least $70 billion might have been identifiable or confirmed at a point. Nyongesa Sande. Some claims go even higher. There are references to $2,300 billion in personal fortune. But these are often labeled as speculative and lack complete public documentation. DictatorBaron.com. It is plausible that Gaddafi controlled Bassa tens of billions of US dollars in assets, possibly more, before his death. The often cited figure of $200 billion is extremely uncertain. It's based on claims from officials and limited investigations. It may include state funds or investments not legally his personal wealth. No publicly verifiable audit has confirmed a definitive net worth total. If you like, I can give you a timeline estimate of what known assets, frozen accounts, properties, investments, were identified after his death, 2011 to 2025, to show how much was When Muammar Gaddafi's regime collapsed in 2011, the world raced to lock down what many called Libya's and the Gaddafi family's hidden fortune. But how much was frozen? How much was identified? And how much was ever returned to the Libyan people? This is the story of assets frozen, investigated, and still trapped by politics and law between 2011 and 2025. As protests swept Libya in early 2011, dozens of countries and international institutions moved to freeze bank accounts, investments, and state funds linked to Gaddafi and his circle. In just weeks, major freezes were announced. The United States reported that more than $34 billion in Libyan assets had been frozen. Cut to map: Britain, France, Switzerland, Italy, the US. The United Kingdom froze billions. More estimates put British freezes in the range of $12 billion, about $19.2 billion at the time. Switzerland identified nearly CHF 830 million in assets linked to Gaddafi's circle. These initial actions reflected a global rush to keep assets from being moved or stolen as Libya descended into conflict. State Funds versus Personal Wealth 2011-2013, stacks of documents, investigators at computers. Two separate but overlapping sets of assets caused confusion. One was sovereign Libya's state funds and sovereign wealth investments. The other was individual property, bank accounts, and investments tied to Gaddafi and family members. Distinguishing the two has been legally and politically difficult. The UN-mandated panels and asset recovery committees spent years investigating hidden subsidiaries, shell companies, and frontmen. Their work aimed to identify what rightly belonged to the Libyan people and what might be criminal proceeds of individuals. The complexity of corporate structures and opaque ownership slowed tracing and repatriation. Security Council Report, Partial Releases and Repatriations, 2011-2015. French officials announcing transfers. Libyan officials receiving funds. Not all frozen assets stayed frozen. Several countries gradually released portions to new Libyan authorities or used limited funds for humanitarian needs. France, for example, released around $230 million in late 2011 to the new Libyan authorities. But most releases were cautious, conditional, and subject to legal review. France 24, across the early post-Gaddafi years, only relatively small sums were repatriated compared with the huge headline numbers. Much of the money remained tied up in legal disputes, transparency inquiries, or frozen because its ownership was disputed. The Libyan Investment Authority, LIA. A case study, 2011-2024. Skyscrapers, corporate logos, LIA reports. A central piece of the puzzle has been the Libyan Investment Authority, LIA, Libya's sovereign fund, created to manage oil wealth. Valuation and control of the LIA's holdings have been contested for years. After audits and court battles, the LIA's portfolio was revalued and publicly reported. By the early 2020s, the LIA's assets were consistently described in the tens of billions, with reporting around $60–70 billion in assets, equities, real estate, deposits, and bonds, under long-term freezes or management disputes. By 2024, the LIA itself publicly expected UN approval to resume active management of roughly $70 billion of assets. Wikipedia. What was actually traced and identified? 2011. 5. Investigators, leaked files, courts, and headlines about seized property.